We believe life can be a journey toward wholeness, toward reconnecting with who we are authentically meant to be. We walk this path of growth and discovery with our children, with our partners, within ourselves. These are the stories of what's possible. These are the conversations that light the way. Welcome to Soul Path Parenting.
Hi, Amy. I'm so excited. And actually, I'm going to emphasize the word excited today because I always say, I'm so excited to be here today and talk with you because on some level, that is always true. And today, I am deeply in touch with the ways that my body is activated and excited to talk with you today about fear because fear. And we're going to start with how fear feels in the body. Fear is activating. It is like adrenaline increasing. It ramps us up and it gets us ready to fight, flight, or freeze. That's the purpose of fear. And excitement can also feel the same way because excitement, we're also getting ready for something. We're preparing for something. So right now, I'm feeling the kind of anxious butterflies in the stomach. My chest is a little tight, but not as tight as it is when I'm really contracted. I'm somewhat expanded, but I can feel the buzzing energy through my body, and I'm ready. I've been preparing for this, and I'm ready to talk about fear. How are you feeling?
I share your excitement, and I agree that the feeling of excitement oftentimes has it's like a first cousin of fear. And so I love that as a starting point for the conversation. I'm really excited to unpack fear because for me, fear spans from this feeling that we can have in our bodies and kind of an emotion that we can come from all the way to this macro idea that's inviting us to awaken and not be driven by fear. And so it's part of our spiritual awakening is becoming aware of fear. So fear for me just spans such a spectrum from feeling to almost like a survival level driver that we're programmed with as humans, and that becoming aware of gives us so much more like power in our lives. So with that, how does fear feel to you in your body?
Yeah. Whew. So, there's so many ways that fear can manifest. So, kind of like I was saying at the beginning, that jittery, high energy fear is in one of the high energy boxes, right? So we talked about our quadrant where fear is in the high energy, and we put fear in high energy, low pleasantness.
Yes.
Because it's like this. And for me, it feels like agitation. It feels like I've had way too much coffee. I love coffee though. And when I'm in fear, when I feel that fear in my body, it's so important for me now to acknowledge that it's there and to be in relationship with it. Because in the past, I was less connected to my body, less aware of what I was experiencing, the physical sensations I was experiencing. And my MO, my way of interacting with fear was to try to eliminate it, to try to get rid of it. And I would react, I would do whatever I thought I could do to get rid of it so that I would stop feeling it rather than now feeling it. So, yeah, I usually feel it in my stomach for sure, but it tingles through my whole body. I'm kind of like shuddery right now because I had some fear leading up to this conversation. In our multiple preparatory conversations, I had one of those moments where I started feeling afraid that I don't really have anything helpful to say about this topic, or what I say will be too complex and confusing because I'm trying to do the both sides of everything. And sometimes then you lose your focus. And I went through a round of fear in my process of preparing for this conversation. And then I had a breakthrough moment of like, this is exactly what I need to talk about.
Yeah.
This is exactly why I'm doing this and why I keep moving through these cycles so I can see them more clearly, feel them, and name them and share them. Because when we are aware and we know what's happening in our body and we can allow it and feel it and welcome it, it doesn't hijack us and affect us in a variety of ways that we're going to be talking about
Yeah.
how fear affects us. So, how it feels in the body. And I'd love to invite you, Amy, to share more about how it feels in your body as well, because I've shared some of
Yeah.
mine.
I as I'm I wasn't gonna exactly frame it this way, but I've gotten more clarity even so far in 5 minutes into the episode, that
Mm-hmm.
my experience of fear is sometimes fight, sometimes flight, and sometimes freeze. And so I can't quite say that there's one way it feels. And I think developing an awareness, I hypothesize that many people have all of those experiences, and it can just come up in different ways based on different circumstances and their own wiring. And so I had wanted to share a story, which I will share now. And as I reflect on it, I realize this was a moment of freeze. I My daughter, Isla, who's now turned 6, when she was 2, became very, very sick. And it's funny because this is a moment of fear. I can
Mm-hmm.
go right back there because it's also a moment of trauma for me.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna let that flow, because in this conversation, we're just
Yeah.
letting the feelings flow. That's the whole idea, is to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I was working full time and traveling for business at the time. And she got really sick, and I took her to the doctor before I left on my business trip, and she got medicine. She was positive for strep throat, and we put her on
Mm-hmm.
antibiotics. And I left for 2 or 3 days. And when I came back, she was within 24 hours. She was so sick she couldn't stand up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I took her back to the doctor, and I had been texting with him before that, and he was encouraging me to let the antibiotics, just give them more time. And I knew we have to trust ourselves, right? I knew this is not this is not right. So I brought her to him, and he
Mm-hmm.
said, "Okay, we're going to send you to the ER at Children's at Rocky Mountain Hospital for Children. They're amazing." Um, to do some tests because we don't really understand what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And we go to the emergency room, and they start to check her out. And the one of the nurses attending this situation, or I don't even know what the person's role was, could have been a physician's assistant, could have been a doctor, I'm not sure, said, "We need to call in the oncologist. Do you know what that means?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I thought, do I know what that means? Like, in other words, do I understand what oncologist means? In other words, do I understand, like,
Mm-hmm.
at the time I was like, well, that's kind of an insensitive way of telling me that you think my kid might have cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but the feeling in my body and the feeling I'm having right now retelling that story, it's interesting how fear can get locked in sometimes. Probably I should do some work
Mm-hmm.
around
Well, no,
this.
this is such a beautiful example, Amy, of how trauma lives in our bodies. Our bodies carry the trauma. This trauma is alive in
Yeah.
your body still, and because you're allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling, which is what this whole series is about. You're experiencing it, and yeah, tell us what you're
So my
experiencing.
heart, even just retelling this story, my heart is pounding. And it's funny, the part of it I wanted to, and so I'm like tearing up, and my voice you can hear is shaky. And it's all the things putting me right back in that moment. And my knees went weak. Like,
Mm-hmm.
my response to her not answering her question was, I need a chair. I need to sit down. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't even take it all in that moment, which is what
Mm-hmm.
freeze looks like. And even now, it's funny. I'm having the same physiological response. I am sitting down to record. I generally sit. I always
Mhm.
sit. And my knees are feeling, I can feel my knees being weak. And
Mhm.
it's interesting to me in this moment. This wasn't planned for this conversation, but I'm curious, and I have a feeling other people listening have experienced like really fear-inducing traumas. What are we
Mhm.
supposed to do about that? Like, is it, am I supposed to somehow release this, or is it quote unquote okay, not to bring judgment into it, that like retelling this story just provokes this for me? Or like, what do we do about trauma?
Yeah. So this is a beautiful example. So I'm going to speak to some of the things that I have recently learned about how trauma lives in the body. And I'll preface with, and if you've been listening for a while, you know me by now. I don't give absolute answers. If you're new to the podcast, if it sounds like I'm giving an absolute answer, it's always more nuanced than that. But this is what happens with trauma. So when you were in that moment facing the possible reality that your 2-year-old, she was 2 at the time, am I
2
saying
years
that
and 1 month
correctly?
old. By the way, I want to say she didn't end up having leukemia as they had thought. We
Didn't end up
found that
having
out
leukemia.
48 hours later.
Right. But in a moment like that, when a parent is facing cancer in a 2-year-old, which I'm a parent, I have 2 children. I haven't specifically faced the very alive possibility of a doctor telling me that my child might have cancer. But I have a story that I won't fully unpack right now. But when my son was 2, we had a scary nerve I was about to say nervous system because my nervous system was a wreck over it. We had a scary emergency room visit. He was sick for a week. He was having trouble breathing. Now I'm going into the details. I didn't mean to. Anyway, what I want to say is to generalize this and talk about how trauma affects our bodies. And this is such a great example, Amy. And you were so beautifully naming the fight, flight, freeze responses. Freeze happens when to take it all in that moment is too much. In that moment, facing the possibility that your 2-year-old was possibly dying of cancer and maybe needed care sooner, like it's over because we parents, we don't want to lose our children. That's I used to teach Hamlet to my high school students when I was a high school English teacher. And one of the themes we discussed was the difference between what we called natural deaths and unnatural deaths. A parent losing a child is considered an unnatural death experience. Parents expect to outlive their children. We expect to lose grandparents and parents. We do not expect to lose our children. It happens. But so fully facing that in that moment, it was too much. Your body said too much. I can't even stand up anymore. Give me a chair. This is too much. It's not okay. And that is a perfectly normal, healthy quote response to a traumatic moment like that. And the fact that it's coming back alive for you now, when we experience freeze, we don't fully feel our feelings. We don't fully process them and we don't fully release them. So they stay in our bodies. So, to your question of what could you do, there are many healing modalities that exist. And I tell all my clients to, be prepared to experiment with things and try to find what works best for you. I have tried a couple of different healing modalities and I've had some success fully feeling and processing and releasing specific traumas that had been trapped in my body for decades. And I have some traumas that are still living in here and I haven't fully processed them all and fully released them all. And I've utilized multiple healing modalities that I could share more about in notes or something later on. But the general idea is through a supported healing modality, you can fully feel in the present moment if you're ready, if you're resourced enough, and, if you co create something that works for you with a healer or a therapist or whatever, it is possible to fully feel now, quote, in the present moment, which is all we ever have, what you didn't feel then and release it and to speak specifically about myself and the traumas that I would describe as I've released them. And the difference for me is if I were to share one of the stories of one of my early childhood traumas. This is one that I released through EMDR therapy, and I can share more about that at some point. But I can share that story now without dissociating from it, but also without my body panicking.
Mhm.
I still feel my feelings around it. The feelings don't disappear. But when we have trapped, unprocessed trauma, and then we're retelling it and reliving it, it's more likely that we'll have some level of a panic experience. So, like what you're describing right now with your knees going weak now, you're like, okay, I'm glad I'm in a chair now
Mhm.
because I need this chair right now. That suggests that there's some stuff in there that you still haven't fully felt.
Mhm.
Because I mean, and let's face it right now. Do we want to fully face the risk of losing our children? I don't. I'll be real honest.
Yeah.
I know that my children could die tomorrow, but now I'm like, Lauren, why did you just say that? What if you're co-creating that? Stop saying these
Cancel,
words,
cancel.
because that's cancel, because that's my resistance to that.
Yeah.
And one of the things we were going to talk about in this conversation, I'll name it right now because I feel like it connects to what we're talking about. There are some wisdom teachers that suggest that all fear originates with our fundamental human fear of death.
Yes. So let's go there because that's a beautiful segue. And
Mm-hmm.
you've talked about kind of how we can see that our fear of death sits underneath all these other fears. And I also want to
Mm-hmm.
segue from I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's important to highlight. Segue from the obvious fears, like fear of losing my child, into those fears
Mm-hmm.
that live in our blind spots, which those are the
Mm-hmm.
fears that I think we can also spend some time helping to bring into view in this conversation and see how sometimes those fears are running the show without us even knowing about it. So, how do some
Mm-hmm.
of the fears that manifest in our day to day lives map back to fear of death?
Yeah. So the for me, aliveness comes with this, like, I currently experience myself as oriented towards aliveness. I want to live. I would prefer to stay alive for the foreseeable future right now. And I would prefer for my loved ones to also stay alive for the foreseeable future. So I experience myself currently as oriented towards life, but that orients me away from death. Like life, not death. And this is a classic either or that's not really an either or, it's a both and. And that is complicated and hard to hold
Mhm.
because it feels like an either or. I want to be alive, not dead. I want my children to be alive, not dead, not dead, not dead, not dead. And is fear feels to me like an aversion, a resistance. Like, people talk about being in fear and being in resistance. Not death, not death, not death. No, 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 no. That's fear. And when I so that's like you were just describing. There's the obvious fear. I don't want to be dead. I don't want my children to be dead. That's obvious. Beneath the surface, if I'm functioning, if I think I'm oriented towards life, but deep down, unconsciously, my primary orientation is away from death, away from death, away. There's a difference there. There's a really important difference there. And if I'm like away from death, no death, can't see death, can't hear death, like I'm thinking of sticking my fingers in my ears, like la, 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 no death. I am avoiding things, I'm dissociating from things, and those things are going to go in my blind spot where I can't see them because they interfere with my like no death, no
Yeah.
death, no death.
Can I bring another sort of layer of distinction to this? Because I'm
Mhm.
imagining our listeners might be like, well, wait, so you want me to say yes to death? Or
Yes.
exactly what are you asking me to do here? And I just want to say about that one nuance here, which is that as humans, our brains have been programmed for survival. And so
Mhm.
if we frame it as survival, that is resisting death. But for me, it's helpful to think of it as like, okay, I have this computer in my head and it is wired to keep me alive, but it misinterprets a lot of things in the world as survival level threats, which are not. And
Mhm.
so,
Mhm.
actually, one way that I like to look at it, and I've really recently been reading some of Zhukov's work. He wrote Seed of the Soul. He also, I'm reading right now, Spiritual Partnerships. And one of the things that I really appreciate about how he's explaining this shift from survival into spiritual growth is that essentially by gaining awareness and growing spiritually, the fear, the survival brain no longer runs the show because now our conscious awareness gets to wake up and run the show. And I really like that.
Yes.
I really like that distinction as a way of helping to dimensionalize. For me, I mean, I have lots of spiritual beliefs that make me not fear death because I believe in this sort of transcendence. And I've got all the beliefs that nobody needs to believe what I believe in order to get super cozy with death. Maybe you're a yes for, like, I'm fine with it. Maybe you're a no. I just feel like there's a different access possibly of saying, like, oh, wait, no, it's going to be my conscious aware brain running the show rather than my survival responses or reactions.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. And I think those survival reactions for me feel like the equivalent of no death, run away from death. And if I think about how my brain evolved to like listen for predators and run away from them so they didn't eat me, that is a no death, run away from death, run away from death. And if I can flight successfully, I'll get that adrenaline pumping so that the fear, the like hearing the crunch in the wilderness of the animal who might eat me, and then that adrenaline floods my body for a purpose, so it's pumping blood as much as possible so I can be as fast as possible so I can run away and live. And if I get cornered and flight isn't possible, then I'm left with either fight or freeze, because if I think I can fight off the threat, again, I need that adrenaline. I need that blood pumping. I need my maximum amount of strength. I fight it off. And then if I'm successful and then I reconnect with loved ones and I relax, I can fully process that and then enter a restore, like a relaxed restore way of being even after an experience like that. But then if I can't run away, if I can't fight it off, then the last option left is freeze. And we freeze. I mean, evolutionarily speaking, animals and even humans freeze when they're about to be eaten so they don't feel it, because nobody I know would prefer to feel being eaten if they have the choice to not feel being eaten.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we experience in our modern world is feeling the feelings that arise in my body at the thought even of losing my child. They feel so bad to me. In some ways, I want to say right now, they feel worse than being eaten. Worse. They feel worse to me. Part of why I'm saying that is because I don't actually fear being eaten currently. Like, I understand evolutionarily speaking that you used to be more of a concern. And so, had I lived then, I might have had a more visceral reaction to the thought of actually being, if I really get into it, I can use my empathic imagination to go, imagine really being eaten, Lauren. But we don't need to do that right now. But but I can imagine losing my child. I've had those moments. And, they are hard moments to walk through. They have been for me. I mean, just again, speaking to my experience, my hospital experience with my 2-year old who was struggling to breathe, who we couldn't figure out what's going on, I froze and I was standing. I didn't think to ask for a chair. It's funny. Now I'm comparing because that's what the human brain does. I'm like, a chair might have helped me. Um, but I was standing, I was holding my child and they're talking to me and I'm in full blown panic, but it's turning into a freeze because I've tried advocating, I've tried arguing with doctors. Like my system is going abort, abort, abort. Nothing is working. You can't fight your way out of this. You can't fight your way out of this. You take him home. He's in worse shape there. So I started freezing and I was holding him and he was fighting and wrestling and miserable. And I like slowly released him down to the ground. And my very ill 2-year-old is now crawling around on the hospital floor. And the doctor looks at me and goes, "That's not okay. Pick him up. The floor might not be perfectly clean. Like he's having trouble breathing. Like we don't want germs." And I was like, I was like in molasses. Like, oh yeah, pick the child back up. But I was so
Yeah.
exhausted and like so it impairs functioning. So one of the other things we wanted to bring into this conversation was how can fear affect us? It can impair our functioning. And back then, I didn't have all the tools that I have now. And so I didn't know what was happening to me subconsciously. I felt bad, wrong, guilty. What kind of mother lets her very ill 2-year-old crawl around on the hospital floor? Apparently, this one, but like that felt horrible. And I have, 80 notes for myself of what I did wrong and could have done better throughout that entire experience. But now I understand what was happening to me and I understand that it's evolutionary and that it makes sense. I don't have to beat myself up anymore. I never had to, but that was my go-to move. Um Now that I understand it, I can empathize with myself.
Mhm.
I can love that version of me. I can go, "Oh," and I can love my son. My son was struggling. I was struggling. It was a horrible experience.
Yeah.
And I have empathy for all of us.
I think what's so I wanna kinda create a bridge because you've been weaving some important understanding of fear throughout this, is we've brought forth these 2 very dramatic stories of fear of
Mhm.
loss that had both of us
Mhm.
frozen, and how it applies to our day-to-day lives is exactly the same thing, maybe on a less obvious level of we freeze the feelings because we can't actually go there. We can't actually feel them. At least that's what we believe. We're afraid to feel them.
Right.
And
Mhm.
then also in our day-to-day lives, fear can be running the show. As a conscious parenting coach, it occurs to me that it would be helpful and important to mention that anytime we are triggered and go into fight or flight, like, I'm out of here, forget this, that is fear also underneath that. And there's
Mhm.
stories and beliefs. And so, in very day to day ways that aren't quite as dramatic as being in the hospital, fear is in our experience every day.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the sort of macro fears that you and I have talked about, and I would love it if you can draw the line back to how this is fear of death, is the fear of I'm not good enough. How does that relate to survival?
Yeah. So, historically speaking, if a human was rejected by their tribe, they often died. So, like human children are born with an instinct that says, please the humans that are taking care of me, please them, make them like me so they will take care of me. And we're dependent on that for our survival. We're utterly dependent as human infants on the adults that are there to care for us, choosing to care for us rather than abandoning us and leaving us to die, which historically would happen sometimes. Infants would be left to die. Nope, we're not going to take care of that one. Especially, I mean, infants that were born with different issues historically in the past, if they didn't seem robust and healthy enough to survive tribe life, why would the adults put energy and resources into bringing it to, you know, through early childhood
Mhm.
if it couldn't then turn around and survive the conditions? So, I mean, there's a biologically, like, understandable, nervous system programmed, I need to not be rejected so I don't get abandoned and die as a human. And I think in our modern world, that translates to I need people to like me, to want me. I need to feel worthy of relationship, worthy of connection. So we need connection to survive and especially to thrive. But we've learned that human connection is necessary for survival, even now in a world where, you know, in my neighborhood, people aren't abandoning babies in the woods that I'm aware of. I think if they were, we'd have police situation here. So, yeah, that's not happening anymore. But we do, we need connection. We need to be seen, heard, feel loved, welcomed, and we strive for that. And we're afraid we're going to fail. And we're afraid we're going to be rejected, and we're afraid psychologically that that leads to death.
Yeah. I love that explanation because I think so it's part of most people's human experience, if not all, to have that fear of unworthiness or not being loved, not being accepted, and knowing where it comes from, that it's just part of our wiring, but we don't have to let
Mm-hmm.
that fear run the show is so empowering.
Mm-hmm. Well, and recognizing that everyone has it, because one of the things that's been so amazing to me about working with clients, parenting my children, I have yet to meet a human who hasn't had, I think this is a universal experience. So we'll see if I get feedback that contradicts this. In my experience, it seems absolutely universalizable because every human I have known, including me, has felt this fear that they're unworthy and that they're alone in that they're the unworthy one. They're the exception to the rule. They're the human that should be rejected but hasn't been rejected yet because people haven't figured out that I'm a fraud, I'm faking, I'm whatever. Like I haven't been found out yet. And there's this universal experience of imagining that everyone else is not feeling that
Mhm.
everyone else is somehow secure and happy. And what we're seeing on the outside with them is what matches the inside with them. It's not true for me, but I imagine it's true for everyone else. I've talked with my children about that. I've talked with every client I've had about this in some way. It comes up in some way. And I always give them examples to help them see how they're making themselves into an exception. So, like, I have a I have a client who, you know, is experiencing imposter syndrome, and it's connected to her career, and she's afraid that people are going to find out that she doesn't really deserve the position that she has. She's not as good as they think she is. And she feels like she's alone. She's the only one because, she's got some prestigious accolades and she's achieved some things in her life. And I asked her, what would you think of another human who had achieved all those things, who did what you had done? Well, they would deserve it. They would be, but I am not. I'm like, okay. So, what's the difference? Like if any other human on this planet had done everything you have done, you imagine they would be prepared and it would be authentic and legitimate for them, but it's not for you. Why?
Yeah.
And this is what we always come back to, some version of this. Well, because I'm different. Because I'm the one that people will eventually find out isn't measuring up like everyone else. And once people really recognize how universal that is, and that it's all of us,
Yeah.
it's not just me. Like I laugh about it now. I'm like, oh yeah, I was in preparation for this episode. I started feeling unworthy. Like, who do I think I am? I call myself a wisdom teacher. I'm not wise. People are going to figure it out. The fear episode is the thing but I am so intimately acquainted now with
Yeah.
imposter syndrome. I'm like, oh yeah, that's my ego freaking out. That's my imposter syndrome. That's my fear of psychic death. This is when I take a risk and I put myself out there and I say some words, and this is where it all falls apart. I get rejected. Amy will boot me off the podcast because she'll be like, I thought you were, wise, but now I'm like, oh, that fear episode. I'm sorry. I'll make up some excuse. I'm busy next week. I can't do the meetings with you. Like it doesn't, this is the crazy, but it's not
I
crazy.
feel like
It's not
I
crazy.
feel like chiming in here because I think there's so much power in sharing our stories of unworthiness that
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
had the exact experience that you're talking about and naming, and I'm I felt so not good enough for so many years, and I also wanna come clean that
Mm-hmm.
I still do sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and now I
Yep.
recognize the voice. Like, it's so funny. I got really for whatever reason, a good example of this is coming up from my, Christmas vacation with my family. So 17 of us rented basically a house, kind of villa situation, um, in Mexico, like
Mm-hmm.
2 hours from a city. Like, it was the middle of COVID, so we were off the grid, almost literally.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there with my whole in-law community, right? My mother and father-in-law, my 2 sisters-in-law, the nieces and nephews, and my children and my husband. And I started having that judge come up of
Mm-hmm.
like, am I being a good enough mom? For the first time on vacation, I actually sat and read a book because I was like, holy cow, there's cousins to play with and there's aunts and uncles. And I sat and I was reading Self-Compassion, which is a lovely, lovely book by Kristen Neff, I believe is her name. And
Mm-hmm.
and then I thought, like, just moments into my bliss of reading this book, I was like, am I being a bad mother? Am I spending enough time with my children? And are the people around me who are clearly seeing me, so they must be judging me, are they having the same thoughts? Which my in-laws are beautifully non-judgmental people. Like, that is not
Mm-hmm.
I'm now projecting my judgment of myself into their
Mm-hmm.
heads. Probably they're not even having any of these thoughts, and I'm sitting there
Right.
like, I'm being a terrible mom right now. And then the beautiful part of where I am in my journey right now is that even though and the irony is that I'm reading a book at the time literally called Self-Compassion, which I highly
Uh-huh.
recommend, which talks about the human experience and having this sense of one of the keys to self-compassion is knowing that we are all in this together. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure if I ever get to or will exit out the other end of this feeling of not being good enough. But what I
Mm-hmm.
do know is that I'm having a much more aware experience of it. When it comes up, I now recognize, oh, that's the voice of the judge. That's not me. She's just here to but she's a part of me. She's just a part of my human experience, but I can go, "Oh, hey, critic." And so that is as much a part of how fear like that is for me how the fear comes up on the day to day. And the if you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to peek into my brain on like a
Yeah.
conversation, so then I go, oh, okay, I'm having these feelings of anxiety. I'm having these feelings of I'm not doing a good enough job or being good enough. Now I'm projecting it onto other people's minds with no regard for what they actually might think. And by the way, does what they think really matter anyways? Like, why do I make that so meaningful? And then I have the self-talk to go, wait, this is what humans do. This is what I do. This is a choice. I can change my thought patterns. And yeah, so that's where I am right now in my journey
Mm-hmm.
of not being enough. And previously, the fear would have hijacked. By the way, this is how we get into, or at least how I personally got into the spiral of zero self care, was never allowing myself to choose to stay in those moments of bliss for myself, because then I
Mm-hmm.
have the judgment of like, well, you're not being a good enough mom. You're not doing something for somebody else. This isn't work. Work is our way to worth. We talked about that last couple shows ago. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just in this place in my personal journey where at least now I can see those things and name them and choose differently. They're not gone, y'all. They're not gone. But
Yeah, they're not gone for me either. It's funny because I got into this spiritual quest for the wrong reasons. And this is making me think of there's a past version of me that used to watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette.
There
And
is me too, a
I
single version of me that
I
thought that
am
was, like,
yeah,
relatable, yeah.
I am embarrassed right now. So I am feeling the embarrassment move through my body. It's tingling through my body because I just admitted that. I used to watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, and I eventually got used to the repetition. There was always this question, are they here for the right reasons? You know?
Yeah.
And I can say about my spiritual quest, I started this spiritual quest for the wrong reasons. I don't think I'm alone. I think that what I'm about to describe is probably relatively common. I wanted to conquer these things. I wanted to eliminate them, eradicate them. And when I say these things, I mean fear, vulnerability, embarrassment. I wanted to transform myself into some imaginary version that didn't get embarrassed anymore because she never embarrassed herself. not because not because she had like made peace with her humanity. Like what has now become opened up to me, what I'm now flirting and dancing with and learning through and interacting with is there is a way to I haven't arrived there yet, obviously, because I'm embarrassed right now, but it is different for me. It feels different. It feels welcome and human now. Like, of course I'm embarrassed, and of course I used to watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. I'm not alone there. And it doesn't like I have a compassionate voice that can speak to the critic voice inside me. So my critic voice, I feel like the internal critic is fear embodied, but it's not embodied. It's this internal voice. But anyway, I like that language. The internal critic, I feel like, is fear talking. Fear is saying, you call yourself a spiritual teacher and you just admitted that you used to watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. Inconceivable, incompatible. No, you can't be both of those things. But now I have this compassionate, truly wise voice. And when I'm grounded and I'm connected to wisdom, I know that this is the true voice. You can be both. I can be both. I used to watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, and guess what, y'all? I used to enjoy it. And I am a wise wisdom teacher now. And I'm also still a very imperfect human who wrestled with imposter syndrome preparing for this episode, who's admitting that out loud because my commitment is to show up authentically. And the way I'm able to do that, the resilience that I draw from, is the connection I now have to the deeper truth that we're all in this together and we're all essentially having our own versions of what I am experiencing. Like, I no longer believe the lie that I'm the weird, messed up one
Yeah.
that doesn't make sense and that doesn't deserve love and connection and happiness and joy and what everyone else deserves. Like, I just don't believe that anymore. And so I'm like, oh, yep, I used to do this and I used to do that. And I made all kinds of mistakes and I'm still making mistakes and I talk about them.
And, even I think I'm imagining our listeners being like, "I like The Bachelorette and The Bachelor too." You can be
Right.
all the things, sister. You can be all the things. The only reason
Yeah.
I don't watch it
Well, and
is because 'cause
listen
I'm
to
not
me
single.
judging my
Yeah,
past self,
totally.
right? Like, what if some of our listeners are still watching and
Reality
enjoying?
TV
I
has
just
a certain
judged them,
fascination
right?
to it that can be
Yeah.
entertaining.
But it's also fun. It's also
Yeah.
fun. Why not have fun? Yeah.
So, because this is a parenting podcast, I would love to segue into how fear can show up in parenting patterns. And the specific patterns that we wanted to highlight are authoritarian parenting and permissive parenting. So, I'd love it if you could shine some light on that.
Yeah, so I think this has come up in a lot of my parenting conversations. And in the same way that we all kind of have our go-to preference coping strategies for all kinds of things, we tend to have it in parenting as well. But what I find fascinating about like authoritarian parenting, which is the kind of rigid parenting compared to permissive parenting, which is the laissez-faire, anything goes parenting. They're not, in some ways, they appear to be opposites, but they're also two sides of the same coin, which I find really interesting. So, and they're both connected to fear, and they're actually both seeking to control. So the authoritarian parent is the one that gets stereotyped as the control freak. And also sometimes the authoritarian parent stereotype includes the parent with high standards and rigid boundaries and rules, and they will control their children's behavior, and they do it under the guise of their being good, responsible parents. You know, authoritarian parents could also be a version of perfectionist parents. They're going to control everything and make it perfect, and there's no exceptions. But their focus tends to be controlling their children's behavior so that the children behave because that's an extension of the parents. That's how they feel like how the children behave is a reflection of me, and I'm going to be correct and they're going to be correct and we're going to make it happen. And it's going to be, if it doesn't happen that way, we'll do harsh things to make it happen. And then on the other side of the coin, you have the permissive parents that could seem on the outside, the stereotype is like anything goes. They seem relaxed, maybe to some people. They seem laissez-faire, almost to the point of neglect or irresponsibility. That would be the critique coming from the other side. But permissive parents are also trying to control something. They're just trying to control something different. So permissive parents are trying to control their children's feelings. Permissive parents need their children to be happy and need their children to like them. Authoritarian parents need their children to behave appropriately and maintain the standard and the presentation to the world. Permissive parents need their kids to be happy and to like them. And that's what they're trying to control. So they seem lackadaisical, but they're actually also controlling. They just have a different orientation. They'll say yes, and it's not a strings free yes. It's a yes, now will you be happy? Yes, now will you like me? Yes, now will you be happy? Yes, now will you like me? And if the kid's like, no, I'm not happy. No, I don't like you. They'll keep shifting the boundaries to try to get what they want to control, which is you have to be happy, you have to like me. Whereas the authoritarian parents, their boundaries are rigid. They're going to control the behavior. They're going to control what they think is the measuring stick of their goodness or worthiness. So both have that in common, right? The authoritarian parents are like, my goodness and worthiness is measured by how well I get my children to behave. So I will make them behave, to the point of sometimes forgetting that our children are little complex humans, and that getting them to behave isn't the end all be all. And parenting is about the parent. Parenting is about what I do, not what my children do. What I do in response to them is who I am as a parent and what I should be, quote, judged on in my parenting, not what they do. They're sovereign beings, ideally. But yeah, so in both cases, parents are coming from a place of fear. They're attached to different stories around what makes them good or worthy and what they need to achieve at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
Behavior, feelings.
One of the things I wanted to highlight, I think it's really helpful to create sort of a vivid contrast between permissive and authoritarian. And also, now that we've created that vivid contrast, I think it's also helpful to say that a single parent can have moments of both, or I'll just share my own story. One can lean authoritarian without showing up in an extreme way. So for me, I would say if I leaned in one direction or the other, which I would invite our listeners to look, like it's easy to sort of dismiss out of hand, like, oh, well, I'm not authoritarian or permissive. The third way being authentic will distinguish that as well. But we can lean in a direction at times, and it doesn't even have to be all the time. My tendency, especially before really becoming immersed in conscious parenting and starting to practice awareness in the moment, is that my prevailing fear was around losing control. So there's other fears underneath these that kind of run the show. And my prevailing fear, and this is one that authoritarian parents or people like me who might lean in that direction. I'm not going to look like a general. You're not going to come into my home and see me barking orders and in very apparent ways being like super hyper controlling, but I lean for sure in towards the control. I used to have this belief that, oh my gosh, if I give her an inch, she'll take a mile. Like if I let any little bit of control go, I'll never get it back because it was all about control. And until I realized that I actually have a different choice, that it's not this like win lose seesaw battle of control. It's actually like, oh shit, why am I over there fighting about control when actually there's this whole other option over here called connection? Let's connect with what she really needs in the moment and be connected with myself as a parent. This was something that constantly would come up when my 6-year-old was 3 at bedtime in bedtime routine. And I really had that belief if I lose control, if I don't keep on top of this and make it happen exactly the way, then she'll just think she can run with it and we'll never get done. And that was my greatest fear because mommy's exhausted. Like bedtime routine, you have to
Mm-hmm.
admit, like that's running the final gauntlet. Like that for me as a parent, at least, has been the test. Right. So then I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
let the test be over, which puts me into the future, not the present. And so I have realized that that's one of the areas where I can become authoritarian. So now I just go, okay, well, how can I've actually experimented with this, and I have a 4-year-old now that has more of the same tendencies that my used to be 3-year-old has had. And their relationship with time is so different. I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
allowing for I wasn't even allowing time for the natural meandering that a 3 or a 4-year-old wants to be able to do inside of the context of, oh, I'm going to brush my teeth, but there's water. Can we play with the water a little bit, mommy? And I used to be like, no playing with water, brush teeth, go potty, stories are next. And then once I started to, I know, right? Now you can see how authoritarian I am. But like, that's my inner voice. That's not
So
so
human of you,
human. And
Amy.
I do that in other ways now because I am a recovering perfectionist, but if anything, I lean towards that inclination. I want to unpack what it means to be a little bit permissive as well. But before I do that, I'm just curious, do you lean more in one way or the other? How do you?
So I've always been kind of a jack of all trades. So I
All of
I
it.
yeah. Well, and I tell people if you're listening and you're like, "Oh, I'm definitely authoritarian all the way." Challenge that and start paying even closer attention to yourself and start asking yourself when and where and how am I consistently authoritarian, and where and when and how do I slip over into permissiveness? And it goes in both directions. So, when I was a younger parent and a less conscious parent, I was a classic case of permissive, 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 permissive until I snapped and went full on authoritarian monster and felt justified in it because I had all the fears. This is part of my gift. I had all the fears. So I wanted my children to like me. I wanted them to be happy. And I wanted their behavior to be good. And I wanted other people to approve of me. I wanted it all. I wanted all of those things. So I would try through the most like kind and gentle ways I had access to back then to like appease my children, but also keep them quiet and behaving so they weren't bothering other people, but they would be happy. They would like me. Everyone would like me. I needed everyone to like me all the time. And but what inevitably happens in either of those systems, because neither one of those are sustainable. So if you take only a few nuggets from this conversation, some of my words of wisdom that I've offered to my parenting clients, and by the way, the number of my parenting clients who have brought bedtime struggles to our parenting coaching sessions is all of them, every single one.
100%.
Without
Yeah.
exception, so far, I have never met a parent who didn't have some form of a bedtime struggle, whether it's they're trying to be authoritarian and stick to the schedule and it's not working because they have toddlers, or they have given up And they're like, we'll sleep when the kid drops to the floor. Like, I guess I can't even anymore. I don't even know what is bedtime. Like, and so, and none of that is sustainable. None of it. Because I advocate for authentic parenting and authentic relationships. And like you said earlier, what that means is my wants and needs matter. The children's wants and needs matter. It's a two-way street. It's a negotiation. It's a dance. We do our best. So maybe that means we have a schedule, but we intentionally build some flexibility into it. And we choose our human moments of playing with water. And we play with the water with the child because we love this child and it's magical that they're here. And to kind of connect this back to fear and fear of death. And earlier, we were going in the direction of me advocating for, instead of all of us running away from death, we need to turn towards death. And you were like, what does that look like? You want us to embrace death, Lauren? What is that? And what it means is, if we face the reality of death, if we keep that in our awareness rather than dissociating from it and avoiding it, like death, la la la, fingers and ears, no such thing as death. If I'm like, I'm going to die, my kids are going to die, why not take 10 minutes and play with the water?
Yeah.
Let's be in this moment that we have right now. Because the unconscious way is, it's either death or life. To choose life, I got to choose not death. Run away from death. I'm running towards life. I'm running away from death. But that puts stuff in our blind spot. Then we're not fully alive. We're not fully experiencing right now, because now contains everything. Whereas if I turn towards death, it actually helps me turn towards life more wholly and completely. I'm
Mhm.
like, this is temporary. Whether there's reincarnation or not, this exact moment isn't happening again.
Yeah.
How do I want to live this moment? How fully do I want to experience it? So, to try to tie all these things back together and come back to your question of the permissive and authoritarian. So, I was a classic permissive until I snapped, and then I was authoritarian because I didn't know how to be authentic. I didn't know how to value me and my kids and negotiate and have flexibility, but also structure. Because as you can imagine, the we'll sleep when the kids sleep, not sustainable, builds lots of resentment and exhaustion, inhibits functioning. Will be so rigid, no playing, no exceptions. It just doesn't work. It just plain doesn't work. And then you're not even getting the result you want. And what are you sacrificing for it? So building flexible structures that are life affirming for everyone, that allow for those moments and those exceptions and the flexibility, but always coming back, because there is the like slippery slope problem, like you were fearing. There's legitimacy there. There's legitimacy to everything. If your boundaries keep sliding indefinitely, they disappear. But if they can't move, they're so rigid, because if they start sliding, they're guaranteed to slide indefinitely. You haven't mastered the art of like the dance. We let them slide a little, we bring them back. We let them slide a little, we bring them back. We choose our moments. We check in. What do I want to choose in this moment? Do I want to let it slide right now and then bring it back? Or do I want to say, sorry, sweetie, not this moment?
Yeah.
We're not going to play with water every time. We're also not going to play with water never.
Right.
We choose our
Yeah,
moments.
and I feel like that's the journey of discovery that parenting can be. Right? Like, I
Mhm.
think many of us raised in the kind of education system that we have currently, that we're also
Mhm.
reimagining as a
Yes,
part of
that we're talking about
the
reimagining,
podcast,
yes.
is that there's some right or wrong way to parent, and so we get conditioned to believe that there's kind of a black or white, but actually the answer, this authenticity, is about playing in the gray, it's the in between, it's all
Mhm.
the things, and so that just
Mhm.
takes practice and a super amount of awareness.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. All right. So I'm inspired right now to try to recap what we wanted to do with this episode and see if we've done it. We talked about how fear feels in the body. We each described some of our embodied experiences of fear, and there's lots of variety here. So listeners could ask themselves, when I'm experiencing fear, how does it feel in my body? Do I feel constriction? My heart rate goes up? My stomach feels uncomfortable? there could be so many other variations to that. So, fear includes physical sensations that show up in our bodies. Then there are the stories that our mind attaches to these physical sensations. And one of my old stories was, this shouldn't be happening.
Mm.
I should not be feeling this. This needs to be eliminated, eradicated. I must get rid of it. And that story impaired my functioning by making me more likely to choose to react in ways that would suppress or repress or push away the fear that I was feeling, or distract myself from it, or I would ignore it, dissociate from it. And that didn't lead to as healthy and whole functioning as what I now do, which is I really do try to welcome it. I know it's here for a reason, it has a purpose. Our feelings are messengers, all of them. The quote good and the quote bad feelings, they all have information for us. They're all essentially trying to help us. That's what they're really there to do. And so now I welcome it. I feel it. I let it wash over me. I notice the mind story. If it's the this should not be happening, I respond to that with compassion and say, actually, it makes sense that this is happening. And it also makes sense that maybe part of me wishes it wasn't. Like there's a difference between, man, I wish this wasn't happening right now, and this should not be
Mhm.
happening.
Yep.
And so now I'm like, oh, okay, it is happening. I kind of wish it wasn't. I'll feel that too. Like I'll feel what's happening, and I'll feel that I wish it wasn't happening, and I'll feel that that's okay to feel all of those things. And then it releases me from the automatic reactions where I'm panicking and trying to get rid of the feelings. And it opens up a field of choices where I can choose to respond, consciously check in the moment, be present to what's happening. And I feel more freedom and expansiveness in that now.
I love that. Yeah. It's like
Mm-hmm.
we're rewiring our brains. Instead of having a survival machine, we get to have an awareness machine or some hybrid. I don't know.
Yeah, well, right, exactly, because we can't get rid of the survival
Yeah.
machine because that's what we're wired with, like you were beautifully saying. But when we're aware of it and we understand how it's functioning, and we can interact with it, we can change our relationship
Yeah.
with it. And that's what I'm all about, is changing my relationships with the realities in my life that maybe my previous relationship with fear when it arose in my body was less healthy than my relationship with fear is now.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's contributing to me feeling more freedom and resilience in relation to these types of things.
Beautiful.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
it. That's what we
Okay.
have to share with you guys about fear. If you want to dive in more deeply on fear, or dive in deeper, I guess maybe the way to say that, there is a chapter in Dr. Shafali Sabari's book, The Awakened Family, chapter 12, that dives into 9 different fears. We've referenced it and kind of brought it in threads. We sort of took it up a level to talk about permissive and authoritarian parenting. But if you want to dive into fear of conflict, fear of not being loved, there's a bunch of different fears that can show up in your parenting in different ways. We would encourage you to reference chapter 12 in The Awakened Family for further study on this topic. Anything
Mhm.
else, my beautiful host?
Just thank you. Thank you for showing up and being real and co-creating these conversations with me. I am learning so much and growing so much from experiencing these conversations. And my hope and wish is that people who are listening are benefiting in some way as well. And so I'm just so grateful.
I
Thank
love
you.
it. And I love you. Until we
I
talk
love
again,
you.
dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.